When you sit down to record a podcast episode, who are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the listener that's casually listening to an episode on the way to work while they're thinking about 30 other things that they need to get done? Or what about the listener who just came across your podcast on LinkedIn and thinks that you would be a great consultant to work with, but they figured that they should listen to a few of your episodes before they send you a message? Or what about the listener that is patiently waiting for your new episodes every single time they drop? These are three very different listeners. And if you want to get the most out of your podcast, you'll need to understand all three. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. So often we're creating our podcast without really having an end goal in mind. Now, why do we do that? Why would we do that? Why would we record a whole podcast episode without knowing what we want to come from it? Now, there are a few different reasons. The first and most consistent I see is we like it. We're interested in this topic. We think it's funny or interesting or cool, and we want to share it with our audience. And you know what? That's okay. There are chart-topping podcasts made from the content of what the host thinks is cool, and everyone follows along. However, for most of us, we don't have the time and energy and money to make a podcast about things we just like or are interested in and hang around long enough to see if other people like it too. But it's funny because so many people that I talk to think this is how podcasts are made. So if we're not creating a podcast from the things that we think are cool and that we like, what are other reasons that we might be making it? Usually it's to promote our brand, and whether that's a personal brand, ourselves, or a business or industry, it has something to do with promoting a larger vision of ourselves. And I think that that's one of the best uses of a podcast. What better way to build a relationship with people and earn credibility in a field or subject than talking about it every week and sharing your thoughts? And where this inevitably will go wrong is not understanding why the audience is listening. We talk about this all the time, but that's what we need to figure out. Are our audience members casual listeners? Are they diehard fans? Or are they customers? Who are we serving and how are we serving them? Let's talk about casual listeners. I think most of us underestimate the power of a casual listener, the person that just stumbled across our podcast from a friend recommendation or another podcast that we guested on, or even just knowing the host outside of their podcast. Weak connections make the world go round. And I think that we all have to pay a little bit more attention to the person that randomly listened to one of our episodes from 3 months ago. You have to have casual listeners before you can have fans. And that's something that we tend to overlook as podcasters. This is a relationship like any other, and listeners have to get to know you. They have to trust you. Make sure that you're giving them that opportunity. A few ways that you can speak more directly to casual listeners is having episodes that aren't built on each other. And what do I mean by that? I mean, when you're recording an episode, you're recording it as if this listener has never heard an episode before. This can be really easy things. Like, let's say that you bring up your wife, Carla, in every episode. So instead of saying something like, Carla loves baby carrots, you should see her scarf down a bag of baby carrots. Instead, maybe say, my wife, Carla, loves baby carrots. You should see her scarf down a bag of baby carrots. You don't have to go way out of your way to make small changes like that, but they have a huge impact on someone that is listening to your podcast for the first time. They feel part of the conversation instead of wondering, who is Carla? Who is Carla eating these carrots? Another thing is having some kind of introduction for yourself and the host of this show. So I do this in a pre-recorded bit in my intro, but you can also do this just at the beginning of your show. In the first 3 minutes, listeners should have some idea of who you are and who is coming on this episode and what is going on. And again, this doesn't have to be super formal. but have a moment to explain. Hey, I'm Morgan. I'm a podcast producer. I'm going to help you grow your podcast. Let's get into the episode of XYZ. Just setting up so people know who you are and what this episode is going to be about. The last thing is to have everything listed in the episode description. Now, what do I mean by everything? I mean all the links that you talked about in the episode, number one. Obviously, that should be in your episode description. But all your social links, ways to get a hold of you, ways to find out more, any relevant information for a first-time listener or a casual listener who might want to find out more about you and the show. I see some podcasters do something like they'll have a link that says, did you like this episode? Here are 2 other episodes that you might like. And I think that is genius. And it keeps listeners listening. At the least, make sure people know how to learn more about you and how they can follow you on other platforms. And ask them to subscribe to the podcast. I know that sounds so elementary, but there needs to be something in your sign-off or in your pre-recorded sign-off that says, make sure you subscribe to the podcast for more episodes like this. We need to remind our audience what we want them to do. And think about how much more likely you are to listen to a podcast that you've subscribed to. So make sure that you're encouraging your audience to subscribe to your podcast. Being aware of new listeners and casual listeners is the best way to turn someone that would have just listened to one episode or a couple episodes of your show into a fan of your podcast. Speaking of fans, what about fans? I'm talking about the audience members that are listening to every single episode of your podcast the day that it comes out. How are you making content with these listeners in mind? Because while we need casual listeners to turn into fans, 80% of your listens are normally coming from 20% of your listeners. So how do we cultivate that 20%? The first thing is understanding why they're coming to your podcast. I feel like I say this on every episode, but you don't have to remake the wheel. Someone is normally a fan of something because they know what to expect. Think about your favorite restaurant. I bet it's your favorite because you know what to expect, whether you're thinking about it or not. They do an amazing job. The food is consistently delicious. You love what they do and they do it consistently. We have to be more like our listeners' favorite restaurants, meaning we have to be consistent. If you are putting out a variety of the same content over and over and over, and people are loving it, that is not a sign that they are bored or that you need to change something up. It is a sign that you are doing something right. And again, this is why it is so important to have your eyes on the analytics of your podcast. What are your download numbers? What is your episode retention rate? Are you consistently getting new followers on Spotify and Apple Podcast and the other platforms that you track? What do people like to hear from you? Don't be afraid of these numbers. I know so many podcasters that are terrified to look at their downloads. The numbers are your friend, because think about this. Let's say that you had an episode that only got 100 downloads when you normally get 1,000 downloads on new episodes. Well, what was that episode title? What did you talk about? What do those episodes that normally get 1,000 downloads have in common? These are all things that we can find out from the analytics, and it is so important for you to know this information when you are turning a casual listener into a fan and keeping them a fan. If you need help figuring this out, I have a 1-hour strategy call that is perfect for this. The information for booking will be in the episode description. And something else to consider is how you are cultivating your community outside of this podcast. I'm working on a full episode on building a community around your podcast, so make sure that you're subscribed. But how are you creating a place where people can talk about your podcast and get excited about your podcast? Are you connecting people with the podcast and with each other? Because that is where the real magic is. You can have fans. You can have people that love your podcast, but the true magic will come when the people who love your podcast are able to find each other. Any good brand strategist will tell you that the magic isn't in the brand or the company or the podcast. It's in how you create a community that identifies with your podcast. Listening to your favorite podcast is a status symbol. It's something that we talk about with other people. It's a connection point. And that's why I say that is where the real magic happens. You need to know how you are creating a community around your podcast to have fans of your podcast. So we've talked about casual listeners and we talked about fans. And that leaves us with one group of our audience to talk about, and that is our customers. So working with podcasters, this is probably the most forgotten group of listeners. And although most of my clients, this is their number one priority is to get in touch with these customers, it's kind of out of reach. So that's why I go back to the beginning of this episode where I say, most of us are not making episodes and podcast content for the true intention of our podcast. And I know it's scary. I know it is not the easy road out. But if you're creating a podcast for the intention of growing your customer base or reaching new clients or making money of any kind, you need to make a podcast that fulfills that mission. So how can we do this more effectively? First of all, making content that positions you as the authority on a subject. That's what I do every week with this podcast. I come on here to position myself as an authority in podcasting. I know for some of us, this is going to take some internal belief in ourselves, maybe even lying to ourselves. Well, let's just call it a fib, maybe even fibbing to ourselves. We've all heard about imposter syndrome, and you might be patient one of imposter syndrome, but you have to get out there and start showing up as the person that you want your clients to see you as. Because having a podcast is such an outstanding tool in business and marketing and personal branding, but you have to use it correctly. So step one is show up as your authentic self and believe in that self. Step two is know what your audience wants to learn about and how you can effectively help them learn that. So let's say that you're a leadership strategist and you help mid to high level managers improve in their role. What do these executives need? What is already being provided from podcasts in your market? How can you answer questions that they didn't even know to ask? How do you position yourself as the leader in the industry and the go-to resource in this niche? Especially that second part. How are you positioning yourself as the go-to resource in this niche? Step three is have an offer. That's what so many of us are missing. If you want to turn a listener into a customer, you need to have an offer, and preferably 3 offers, one at a low introductory price point, one at a mid price point, and one at a high price point. These offers should be a natural extension of what you talk about on your podcast and what listeners are coming for. So explain a problem in an episode and then pitch your service as the solution. No matter what you do, have an offer and consistently pitch it on every episode and put it in every episode description. Our customers need to know what they can buy, where they can buy it, and why they should buy it. And you as a podcast host, you have so many opportunities. All 3 of these points can be easily covered in every single podcast episode. So the next time that you sit down to record a podcast episode, I want you to take a moment to think about these 3 listeners. The first being the casual or first-time listener. How do we capture their attention and turn them into a fan? For our fans, how do we consistently provide them with the podcast content and community to keep them engaged? And then finally, what about our customers? How can we effectively position ourselves as the industry leaders and create offers that are an extension of our podcast? If you have questions about how to better reach and convert these 3 segments of your audience, I have a 1-hour strategy call that would be absolutely perfect for you. The information for booking is linked in the episode description. And as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.